we have three presenters. Joe Dickman from the Climate Investment Funds. Maury Rapolinen, am I close?
Yes, quite close.
From the Finnish Foreign Aid Agency, and Joe Puri from the Green Climate Fund. So we have a huge depth of experience and knowledge and breadth in the discussion, and we should just get going as soon as I get the questions up. So the first question really has to do, I'm not getting the questions up, so I'm going to have to outlive them. The first question has to do with the vision for an understanding of formative and real-time evaluation. So it's entirely at the, what is it? Is it fit to eat? Is it any use? That sort of stuff. We will address two subsequent questions. What purposes are served and what might this function look like? So the purposes that are served are sort of in the first question a little bit, but we'll hold back addressing that until we get to the second question. Joe, do you want to start?
Sure. Thanks, Andy. I think both of these concepts of formative and real-time evaluation are critically important, and I like how Andy kind of broadly denoted them because it implies that there are a wide spectrum of approaches to doing these things and to incorporating elements of real-time or formative evaluation in many different kinds of evaluation exercises. And I find myself, in a practical sense, borrowing from different types of evaluation, whether it's utilization focused or realist, and then fitting aspects of each into the practical day-to-day work of the evaluations I work on. And so in my view, in many, if not most evaluation processes, there are elements of real-time and formative evaluation that are important to incorporate. For me, for real-time, this means sharing early and interim insights with a range of users and stakeholders early and often as you go along throughout the process, and bringing people along in that learning journey, timing the sharing of these early insights or interim findings to the most useful moments for decisions or learning. And often, as Andy said, that means trying to speed up the cycles of the evaluation process, even if findings aren't fully validated or fully triangulated, but the early insights that are useful to people when they need them most. In some cases, it could mean slowing things down. If you want to time the launch of a big report or sharing of key findings to a key event or decision-making process to get the most out of it. But it's really about timing to where you're making decisions or thinking about key issues. Similarly, for formative evaluation, I believe this distinction between formative and summative is sometimes unhelpful. Whatever stage the evaluation is at, I would hope that there would be elements that are forward-looking and learning-oriented. And if it's at the close of the program, well, it can inform other programs or other initiatives in the future. And I find, like with evaluations, one of the reasons we fail often to be compelling is that we're so backward-looking. We're obsessed with the facts and the previous events of what happened. We recently had an evaluation that was half looking back, and fully 50% of the analysis was looking forward. Market trends in renewable energy, where can concessional finance be deployed in the future? And some traditionalists, I would say, in evaluation, well, that's not evaluation, that's market scoping. No, it's making it relevant. It's making the findings of the past relevant to the future. And it was that forward-looking part that got most of the uptake and the interest amongst our stakeholders. So I'll just wrap up there. I think both are incredibly important, and there's various ways of integrating both concepts into whatever kind of evaluation you're doing.
Thank you. And I'm very pleased to be here. It is always so enthusiastic to speak those who are really interested in evaluation, fond of it. So it's much easier than maybe some other audience. But I still think that this is very important to be also critical towards this new somehow new, or are they new, these topics that comes every while and once a while in the evaluation? Why I always, when I hear some new type of evaluation, I start thinking, why is that? What is the purpose of this? Why is this raising up now? And to what of these, which of these approaches it is linked to? So I'm quite theoretical person, and theory is my practice. So I come from the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Finland and their Development Evaluation Unit, and maybe my aspects are related to donors' point of view and also the commissioners, evaluation commission's point of view. But for me, this real-time evaluation comes under the headline of development approach of evaluation. And developmental evaluation, you can show maybe one of the next first slide. It is the main, yes, I think the main definition is that evaluation in itself produces learning and know-how. We can learn throughout the evaluation process, not only afterwards. That's why there are some essential elements. It has to have that developmental purpose. It has to be designed to support change and learning, not only improvement. Sometimes at project evaluation, the purpose is improvement. But if we think about policy level evaluations and system level evaluation and transfer change, it has to be more than only improvement. It has to have also an innovation aim. It has to focus on change. And always there is a complexity inside and system thinking. It has to be contextual. That's I really like a lot, because learning is not general. For me, it's quite contextualized. Of course, it has this utilization focus. It has to identify the users. Naturally, there is that participatory element, but we are talking quite often very generally this participation. It has different stages. It can be only, for example, the evaluant can be only informants, but they can also be co-learners. That's why evaluator is a co-creator and brings the evaluative perspective to this kind of formative evaluations. And the feedback loops are very important for learning. That's why I think that when we talk about real-time evaluation, it might be good to think separately the project level evaluations and then the systemic level, policy level evaluations. Why we are doing these real-time evaluations? Because we can make judgments quite rapidly at the project level, and they are process-oriented. And maybe this evaluation is designed to development to continuous change. But when we are talking about the policy level evaluations, it has to inform decisions for further policy changes or how to prioritize and emphasize new priorities in, for example, in development evaluation or in development cooperation. Is it? Maybe I stop here. Yes.
Joe?
Thanks, Andy. So I'm from the Green Climate Fund, as Andy introduced me, and for me, the two questions were really interesting. So to what extent, what's our vision for formative or improving, or evaluations that can be used for improvement, and what's our vision for responsive or real-time evaluations? one of the key things that we realized when I started the office of the Green Climate Fund was that we didn't know what our baseline was with respect to GCF investments, right? So it's $5 billion basically that have gone in for over the past 4.5 years. And here I was sitting lonesome in my office, and I didn't know where to start from. And we had to think about capacities, and we had to think about, well, what's the vision for evaluation? So it was really a relevant question when Andy posed it. Couple of things that we do, and over the past 2 years that we've done, is to think about how to be ahead of the game. One of the tasks that the board has given us as the Independent Evaluation Office is also to advise the board in a strategic way. And that's what makes us responsive, right? So, for example, we just finished a forward-looking performance review of the GCF, which was backward-looking, definitely, to the extent that we could look at GCF in a backward way, given that it had 4.5 years or 5 years of history. But, and this is where this question is really interesting, we had to look at GCF's new strategy, just because this was the zeitgeist, this was the need of the time, right? GCF was a new institution, we were a new institution, and the need of the hour was not so much looking backward, because there's only so much evidence in terms of performance. But the need of the hour was to look forward and to let GCF know as to how it could become stronger, faster, better. And that was the responsive part of our function, which we took very seriously. But I also want to show you, excuse me, Andy, just for a second. I also want to show you some of the initial work that we did to look at GCF's own investments. And I want to, so what we did was, by the time, when there's a professor at the University of Connecticut, and he and I collaborated on this work, and we looked at the initial quality of GCF's investments for the $5 billion. And this, by definition, was project level. So, you know, this is apropos the morning keynote. But we had to start from there, even if we wanted to get to the level of, you know, GCF as an overall international agency. And when we started to look at all of the programs and projects, we found that there was very little that we could say was incorporated into GCF's investments that would make them evaluable or make them ready for us to say that GCF was being effective 2 years later, 5 years later, etc. And so our initial results from just this evaluability or quality at entry work was that currently we found that most of the investments did not incorporate into themselves these ideas that they would have to report on impact, that they would have to consider whether they were being effective or not. 90%, we said, would basically come out with completely overstated, unworldly commentary on how impactful they were being. We also found that there was a possibility that they could inform their overall impact, but they weren't building for it. Just another slide that I want to show is that very basic things at the beginning of time were just not included. And we looked at, you know, normative standards of what should be a theory of change, just a logic model. This will lead to the next thing, will lead to behavior change, for example, because that's really important in climate. We found that most projects, and I feel bad saying this, but we took it to the board as well, and the board took this up in their own understanding of what needs to happen. But basically, very little discussion of causal pathways. There was magic happening in the middle after you did the activities and the outputs, and then there was magic, and then there was, you know, impact, and suddenly we were affecting the world. And we had to do a lot of this work at the beginning, which was, from where I'm sitting now, both formative as well as reactive or real time. And then it led us to also discuss, that's my time. It also led us to discuss as to what we should set up as a program to help projects build their own capacities to inform this impact in a far more credible way. But that's for the next question. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you to the three of you. And we're clearly going on to, we've already started to broach our way to the second question, which is really about who is the evaluation for, what does it address, what's its purpose, what's its functionality. And it's a very open slate, not trying to close any of the discussion. So maybe, you okay go starting over in the same order? That's one thing we didn't discuss.
Thanks. So purpose, who's it for, and risks. I think how you frame it, we're talking about formative and real time, how you frame and implement it matters a lot for the level of cooperation and buy-in you're going to get, and then ultimately the level of usefulness in terms of who and what it's designed to serve. And so if our goal is continuous improvement, often as evaluators we can alienate program managers or implementers by coming across as a kind of more audit or performance or compliance assessment type language. And the term evaluation carries a lot of baggage. I mean, who amongst us wants to be evaluated? So it can be off-putting. And so one thing that I've found that is quite useful is sometimes reframing the term itself. If we're truly in the formative or pre-formative stage, calling something a learning assessment or continuous improvement exercise can help to get people on board and demystify some of this arm's length aspect. And so then being clear about who is this for, and being explicit that sometimes there are evaluations and performance assessments that need to be done that are critical for a board or a governance committee or a management team, and others that are more geared towards operational effectiveness. And sometimes you can blend the two, and that's our hope in many of our cross-cutting evaluations, and they do meet the bar of tending to those both audiences. But sometimes we can actually make a distinction and separate the two, and that can be a bit cleaner at times. And so one way we've done this in implementing the SIF Evaluation and Learning Initiative is we essentially have two main modalities for implementing evaluations. One, we have a set of strategic cross-cutting independent evaluations that we manage directly. And the second is through a set of demand-driven evaluations that we commission through a call for proposals modality to the entities that implement and are stakeholders of SIF projects. So the development banks we work with, the recipient countries who receive the financing, and the civil society actors that are part of the SIF community. We have our advisory group review these proposals for alignment on learning priorities and quality assurance. And over 2 rounds in 2 years, we funded 21 of these different studies. And they tend to prioritize the more technical challenges or issues key to operations, and they also integrate evaluative aspects with thematic research or future scoping exercises. And I think both types of evaluations have been used for continuous improvement and formative purposes in different ways. But obviously the project teams and the operational teams, those evaluations that they themselves have proposed and have taken a direct role in undertaking, find incredibly useful. And there's also a peer-to-peer uptake element to it as well, where if one of the big development banks sees one of their peers doing an evaluation on, I don't know, private sector and forests or gender and renewable energy opportunities, they're more likely to see them as, oh, they're one of us. I can relate to what they're going through. If they can do it, maybe I can do it. So you get that peer credibility and sharing element as well.
So I really somehow place this is in a big approach of developmental oriented or developmental evaluations. So why real-time evaluation is now very topical? Maybe there is, as mentioned already, that there is a desire for more timely evaluation results. Through this kind of process-oriented evaluation, we can improve evaluability and also promote learning. But how? It takes time during the course of implementation, of course, and it has to provide immediate feedback. And it is, in my mind, it is more internal evaluation than external, because the demand and the need comes from inside, for example, the organization or the process, and it is rather looks rather than the process than the impact. Of course, it can, for example, we can use it as an intermediate evaluation or review during the process. And as mentioned, it's formative by nature. We have to remember that when we're saying that something is formative, it also affects on the purpose, on the questions, and the informants, and how we manage the process, and how we report the results. So it's not easy to just say that, okay, this is formative, because it affects so many issues in the framework or the setup in a evaluation. So what was my next? There are challenges because, as I mentioned, there are no standard procedures or how we choose the evaluators. Should we use external evaluators? How we report? What kind of resources we should need? Or what is the continuity of these real-time evaluations? Is it only one short attempt to help the process, or does it continue there? Also, some of evaluators are saying that this is too close to monitoring. This is consultation. This is not evaluation. Or sometimes we think, is this enough developmental? Are we just saying that this is formative and then we go there and then we take the results and say goodbye? And there is always that tension between accountability and learning. And I try to think somehow the distinction between the project evaluations and the centralized evaluation, the policy level evaluations. I think that this is very suitable for midterm reviews, because they have shown to be very useful. The project actors use those results. For example, our own meta-evaluation on our projects, and also the knowledge management evaluation show that midterm reviews are useful. That's why it's very useful to have this kind of real-time evaluations. But we also have found in Ministry for Foreign Affairs that we are not so good at the final evaluations, that the quality of the final reporting varies a lot. So I think that this means that it is not enough to have only one real-time evaluation. Maybe we should plan these kind of evaluations from the beginning of the project plan there. So there are many maybe various of actions using the real-time evaluations. The strength of this kind of approach in project level is that, of course, the results can be disseminated immediately, and we can also involve local people there. And maybe use local evaluators, so it is also capacity building. But it means that this kind of project has to be very adaptive and managed adaptively, and also has a lot of flexibilities there. And shortly, what we think about the central level or policy level evaluation and real-time evaluation or formative evaluation there, this maybe serves leaders or management of the programs more, or the ministries, decision makers, but it has to feed the development of new instruments or channels or funding or some priorities, but there has to be some kind of institutional or organizational level ongoing reform or reform processes where you can put this kind of approach of formative evaluation. And the institutions, organizations has to value learning. Otherwise, it's not easy to just put formative evaluation there and produce and say that let's us learn together here. And it's some kind of institutionalized learning from result has to be there inside in the organization. That's what I think. So, and we can't somehow apply or provide this kind of formative evaluation without managers are involved in this kind of change or value learning with their own staff, for example.
Excellent. You go there. Do you want to go over to
It is
slides, or
easier
you-
to.
No, I don't need slides now. Thank you, Andy. So just as a recap for myself, more than for you, the two questions for this one are, who are the users, and what purpose does formative and responsive evaluation serve, and then what are the risks, right? So what we did when we basically looked at the quality of the investments that GCF was making was that we realized that we needed to think both locally and globally. And I have to say that, apropos again, the keynote discussion this morning, I think it's a false dichotomy for us to say that we have to do only one and not the other. I keep thinking about, 5 years later when the GCF board comes back to us and says, okay, now we're about 10 years old, tell us how much impact the GCF is having. And there's no way that I can magically conjure up a number which is at the strategic level unless I'm going down and looking at every dollar that's basically being invested on the ground. So you have to think about it. It could lead to some what are called ecological fallacies. And we understand that there are risks of aggregation. But it's really important to start to think about all of those levels as well as the interim levels. So what did we do? Excuse me. So what did we do? We started with two things. One, at the project level or at the investment level, we started to work very closely with our investments on the ground. Yeah? So just to give you an example, we were looking at the small island developing states, for example, that GCF was investing in, and we found that there were basic things that were missing. Project design had something like, and this is in the on the island of Nauru, for example, project design had all of these considerations about strengthening ports. This was an ADB project. But at that time, at least, in the design, and this was after it had been approved, we realized that there was very little consideration being given to increase in port traffic and population increase, which clearly was going to happen. And the project managers and our colleagues at ADB knew. But it was really important that that be brought into understanding the risks of the project. So we started then with what's called our learning-oriented real-time impact assessment program, which is essentially working with GCF investments on the ground while helping them build independent data collection systems as well as independent analytical systems. Because we also realized that there was this risk, and this is the other part of the question that Andy's asked us. What are the risks if as an evaluation office, and especially as an independent evaluation office, we start to think about real-time assessment while also being independent? Does that pose a challenge? And I think the way we've at least so far answered it is that we think about independence in terms of generating data independently and analyzing data independently and being able to speak truth to power. But of course, we're not going to disconnect ourselves from the investments that GCF is making, because that would just make us irrelevant. So the idea is that as we work with the investments and as we work with our colleagues at the Secretariat and in management, we are building our own capacity to do independent analysis and produce independent results while informing the projects in a real-time way. And that's what learning-oriented real-time impact assessment, so LORTA, LORTA, does for us. Yeah? And then on the On the risk side, we had to confront this idea of, well, does this mean that we are discounting our own independence? And again, the way we've answered it is that our analytical systems, our data collection systems, and our result systems are independent of how the project rolls out, how the investment rolls out, and how they design. So we provide them the project results and/or the interim evaluations and/or interim findings, which are independently processed and analyzed by us, and the projects can use them as they wish. One of the cool things that I think we've done is that we recognize that we want to answer not just the how something works and why it works, for whom it works, and under what circumstances, but we've also recognized that it's really important for us to answer the how much question. Right? How much is something working? Because we want to be able to have measured impact. And so in a lot of our LORTA work, we've built in, at the beginning, counterfactuals and comparison sites, and worked as well to understand as to where we can measure data in. And so a large part of that measurement is done by the IEU, but in an independent way. So we look at comparison sites and we measure baseline and end line as the project essentially evolves.
Hi, I'm Catherine Shea. I work for the World Resources Institute, and thank you. This has been a very interesting discussion so far. So one of the things that you said about real-time evaluation was that people would say then it's just monitoring. And my gut reaction to that is, well, who cares? That's just semantics. Okay, shouldn't we be bringing them closer together? But the truth is that there is an institutional history to this, especially in large organizations that have been doing this kind of work for a long time. And so I wondered if you could speak to the way that bridge happens. That's just finished. The way that you kind of bring those things together and make that institutional change where what is monitoring and what is evaluation actually come closer together, and people begin to accept that in the context of that institutional history. Thanks.
Stefano Derico from IID. Mine is more of a comment actually about some experience on doing this type of real-time formative evaluation. I guess an experience from the UK, where there is a lot of attention to new methodologies in evaluation. I guess one consideration is that it's great to hear so many positive experiences, but the reality, I think, in terms of the formative and real-time evaluation is that they come with a lot of challenges. And the real, to me, key to address those challenges is to have a very good management process of those evaluation and very good managers of evaluation. Because the reality is that when you come to evaluate, for example, the work of grantees, they don't see you as the good advisor. They see you as the evaluator that could put an end to their programs. That's the reality. You see in the market things like payment by results programs which are accompanied by real-time formative evaluation. And then what happens is that the grantees, of course, is not really telling you the truth of what's going on because their program is linked to a payment by results scheme. So I guess, the question is how do we address, it's all, logically makes a lot of sense. We come in as evaluators, we provide advice, and then that gets into program implementation. The reality, though, that I can see is very, very different.
Completely agree with what's been said, particularly on this risk of not having enough information to serve the accountability function. It's kind of early, right, with the real-time evaluation. Same thing with the JEF. You have a 4-year replenishment cycle. Projects are barely approved. And the council wants to know, so what's the performance and whether these projects are on the right track. Evidence is weak. At best, you can comment on evaluability to some degree or on design. what the biggest risk one runs is that the project managers are reluctant to share a lot of information early on when they've barely started their programs and you're already looking to evaluate them. So I think my question to you, Joe, is what was the reaction from the program side of the GCF as you were undertaking this mammoth evaluation? And what did you do to actually sort of allay their concerns that this was very early feedback? Same thing to Joe from the SIF. You know, you started some early work on transformational change, et cetera. How did you maintain the interest from the program side in what you were doing and really convince them that this is truly about them learning and improving design?
Thank you. My name is Henning Nord. I'm from Danida in Denmark. We have been testing an RTE approach, and I say approach because I don't think there's a fixed model for this for the last 5 years. And some of the findings I hear here today very much resonate what we have found during that period. I think there is, for us, a big question about what is in fact the evaluation lens we have running the way we do RTEs. What is the basic connection to the monitoring work that is often connected into the implementation of the program and the project manager responsibilities. So my question would be a little, what is the evaluation lens here? What makes the difference? And I like the idea perhaps of not calling it a real-time evaluation, but perhaps something else. Because we also know if we want to have those changes that Joe was saying, we need to be closer to the operation. I mean, we need to be a critical partner around the theory of change, collection of data and things like that. So my question would be a little, what's your feeling around the evaluation lens on this? And a second thing is the question about the responsibility for following up on findings from RTEs. Normally we have an accountability during ex-post evaluation that the programs have to react at least to feedback on some of these recommendations coming up. What is the real position or role of the RTE with respect also to point out things that needs to be changed? And what is the accountability of the programs to, in fact, to react on this? Are they on the same level as when you normally have a more conventional evaluation process? Thank you.
I appreciate the discussion. It gives us a lot to think about. And I can really relate to what, Joe, what you kind of started with, which was, it doesn't really matter what we call these things, and you borrow and you pick and steal and you bring together whatever you want. The key is to understand what questions are you trying to answer? And often we don't think about that. We just start in with whatever, we're doing a summative evaluation, we're starting real time, but we don't think about what is it that we're trying to get at. And I think that's the real difference. And I think that gets into a couple points. The other point that was made here was that somehow you get more uptake during midterm review evaluations than end-line evaluations. And that's because we ask different questions there. The midterm review is about trying to make the program better, trying to get it back on track. And people often wait and don't do things that came up during monitoring because they know there's going to be a midterm review, and that is the acceptable point for review. At the end, it's a summative process, which is an accountability process. It's almost like project audit. There's not a lot of interest there. Not much good can come from that stage. Unless we think about changing, again, the questions. I guess that gets into Catherine's point about difference between, I think, monitoring and evaluation. I think we have the privilege, when we are doing real time, to step away from monitoring and ask slightly different questions. And that is really the difference, and that's the value added of, I think, real time evaluation and what we should focus on for value addition. And then finally, just a question for Joe. I'm really curious about your work ex ante to try to make sure these systems are in place to make evaluation easier and have a real chance at trying to say something about impact. What is required with that? What are the inputs? Our organization tries to do some of this, but it becomes very superficial. And so any insights on how that can actually be done more substantively would be helpful.
Hi, Simona Varga, Czech NGO People in Need. I just want to echo what several of you have been saying about the difference between monitoring and real-time evaluation. I had the same thought while we were discussing. I think for me, the most important thing is who is involved in it. In our programs, we do indicator tracking. So it's where like M&E team is gathering data and putting it into a database. And then we have quarterly reviews where the project manager or program manager sits with the M&E team and with the country management team, and they discuss the why. So like the monitoring data comes up with what is happening, and then several people are involved in the discussion on why and how. And I think this also to some extent solves the problem that was mentioned earlier, which is how do you involve the program implementers? How do you get them to buy into the results? How do you get them to not feel evaluated and actually to feel like they are part of this process themselves? And I think for us this is working quite well. I mean, of course, there's always space to do better. But yeah, and I do agree with what you just mentioned about the midterm evaluation being often the most important compared even to the final evaluation of a program. But at the same time, I think if we have the practice of doing more frequent reviews that involve program staff, then they don't feel like they have to wait until the midterm evaluation to actually take action on the data that's being received. So I think this is maybe something that I would like to hear maybe more about from your experiences on how to do it. Thank you.
Really quick question for Joe. So from institutional perspective, I want to know, when you have a huge portfolio, how practical is LOTA? And a related question on monitoring. So what are your thoughts on using not independently collected monitoring data?
Hi, my name is Johannes. I'm from UNIDO Evaluation. The discussion about the lack of evidence for formative evaluation, I think one of the sources of evidence that all of us probably, especially the evaluation outfits, sit on is the pool of lessons learned and recommendations that are generated. And that is oftentimes not really used enough. So I think as an example, recently I was asked by management to provide a view on the new HR policy of UNIDO. And of course I have my personal views on HR policy and I love to comment on it, but I had to take an evaluation view angle, of course. So what I did, I looked into the last 4 years evaluations, what they say about the HR performance, HR aspects, and as a matter of fact, I found in the policy a lot of angles where they had not taken into account evaluation lessons, evaluation recommendations at all. And this is really something that is evidence that can be used. So I think if we ask for a standardized approach for formative evaluations, using lessons learned and recommendations from previous evaluation would be a standardized step that I would recommend.
Thank you, Ivan Bernhardt, evaluation expert. I would like to add on what Kita said and what the gentleman from ADB said and what the lady said. Yes, I have done quite a few midterm evaluations, or well, this is a real-time evaluation, definitely. And what Gita said, in the first 2 or 2.5 years of the program, you don't really have such big results, but you have the project team. You can look at the program design. So you focus more or less on the program design, on the very first actions that are taken from the project, and I find it quite useful, and the program managers, as the lady said before, they find it also very useful because they still have the first experiences of implementing the project, and we look at M&D data. Sometimes they are there, sometimes they are not. It depends which key performance indicators were set, but definitely the program managers, the implementers have to be convinced that this is an exercise which will help them implement the project, because many times the baseline is not set correctly. So we try to amend this somehow so the program would be more successful.
Reacting to what some colleagues said, Fabrizio Felloni from IFA, the evaluation. Some talked about midterm reviews, midterm evaluation. In our organizations, for example, midterm reviews are done by management, not by evaluation. And there's one issue there, which is in many cases, these midterm reviews keep the intervention, be it the program policy, as the objective of intervention as untouchable. That's the main problem. You assume that the objectives are constant, and you see whether they are implemented or not. That's a strong assumption, because if you think in a sort of developmental perspective a la Michael Patton, that's what instead you want to question, whether the objectives were set in the right way. And that's what an evaluation should be doing, and it doesn't happen in many cases.
Yeah, Mike Spilsbury from UNEP Evaluation Office. Just a quick one on sort of, I'm going to put my glasses on so I can read the question properly. But scale and scope. A lot of the discussion has been about sort of project and program level, formative, real-time stuff. And I think one of the most impactful formative evaluations that we've done was basically you have the formal program of work and strategy for the organization being approved, at which point, as soon as it's approved, we're not involved in design, quick, do a formative evaluation. And you start looking at the extent to which the design for the whole organization's interventions in the world makes sense, what the strengths, what the weaknesses are, how the portfolios stack up against the results frameworks, and you feed that back to management, and you're actually having a leverage and influence on the whole work of the organization. So it's just like, yeah, there's scope for these types of things to be happening at a level above project and program and influencing the whole sort of organizational approach to things. So just wanted to say that that's something to think about as well when we think about real-time and formative stuff. Thanks.
We have to now give the panel a chance to respond because they were asked some questions, etc. But we're going to hold it to 5 minutes because we want to get to question 3, because a lot of your comments address question 3. So I'd ask the panel.
Answer with the question 3.
Pardon?
I would like to answer with the question 3.
You want to do the same? Oh, for God's sakes. Come on, we had an agenda. Okay. That's right. And adaptive. But I would like, there's some specific questions that were asked to people on the panel. And what I'd like to do is continue the general dialogue. Let's hold the specific questions, the responses to the specific questions to the end, because there is always the possibility that if as a group we don't address them, then you can do it in a bilateral thing after, okay? So let's emphasize the group process rather than the specific ones. And on you go.
All right.
I don't know whether you're going to do 3 or respond, but I'm taking time.
Here's to real-time adaptation. No, there's a convergence here of what I was planning to talk about for 3 and what the questions came up with. So maybe I'll do a bit of a blend and see where that takes us. I hear more about this tension of evaluators and getting buy-in, and I agree with Jo and her example about going closer to learning with the programs as they go along through the LORTA, which is a great example of doing that, year by year. When I worked with the MasterCard Foundation, we set up 7-year learning partnerships with evaluation firms or think tanks that would accompany a set of partners or grantees within a portfolio of common work over a 6 or 7 year period. We had about a half dozen of these, and they would come in at the beginning of the work. They would do baselines, then they would do annual reviews that would have a thematic lens based on what those group of grantees wanted to learn about. challenges they were facing, participation rates of different groups, outcomes, contextual factors, whatever it was, that critical friend would both look at progress and implementation, but more importantly for the implementers, they would look at key thematic issues in more depth and then come to the annual meeting with some evidence and hopefully inform adjustments as those programs and projects were implemented. So that's one way to do it. I've taken that example to the CIF, where in our pilot program for climate resilience, we instituted a learning partner. This was Oxford Policy Management Limited and One World out of South Africa, where they went to each regional meeting of PPCR countries, heard what the learning priorities were, and prioritized one or two topics to do a rapid response knowledge brief. One was micro insurance and microfinance for climate resilience. Another one was looking at management of water resources, especially local water resource management, and then would deliver that back at the next meeting of that region, either within that the following year, or we'd have a global gathering of countries every 2 years. And so that kind of rapid response, this was a pretty innovative piece of work. They also co-created those knowledge briefs with the countries, the development banks, and the civil society actors, where they were finding interesting best practices or challenges. And so those groups would then go back and present to the wider group at the next meetings. So this idea of embedding a learning partner, you know, the midterm evaluation creates so much angst and animus within the project management, because they know that's a critical point. You know, you're going to, at times, there could be funding decisions tied to the midterm evaluation, there's future trajectories, and you have this multi-year build-up towards it. Whereas if you have a routine learning partner, it's not all rosy. It's not that there wasn't conflict or tension at times between what they were finding and the program's response, but it's a little more adaptive in real time and perhaps seen as a critical friend in the process. Now, I would always get questions about that model of, well, aren't you sacrificing independence, and haven't they actually just become another project implementer and partner? And sure, yeah, there's a risk of that. But I agree with Joe that if your processes for data collection are credible and robust and independent, the data itself is being looked at objectively, then you can manage that more easily than you can manage, you know, someone flying in from 10,000 feet at year 5 pretending to tell people what to do. So I think it's a trade-off worth making. There's a question, and this relates to another example I had for question 3, so I'm still answering the questions, Andy. But there was a question on early implementation, and is it too early to see results, and what do we do in that case? We had a case where the CIF, through the Forest Investment Program, finances one of the largest programs that was designed by and for Indigenous peoples. It's called the Dedicated Grant Mechanism for Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities. It's $50 million that gives money directly to Indigenous peoples groups through a governance structure that's run at the global and the national level by Indigenous peoples representatives for projects for forest conservation and other activities. And this was such a novel, interesting approach, especially being run by the big multilateral development banks. The World Bank took the lead on this. It was so new and novel, even though we were only in year 2 or 3 of actually getting this thing going, and the first grants were only starting to be disseminated on the ground. There was interest from multiple groups in documenting the early lessons, even in designing this whole thing, which was a project in and of itself. I'm at 5. All right. Well, I went short on the earlier one, so maybe I have a minute or two to complete them. But we got this question of, well, wait a minute, you can't evaluate. Our grants aren't even out there yet, but the design process itself was quite empowering, and it was making a difference at both the national level and the global level. And the decision-making process was happening now. The governance committees were discussing, do we scale this up into other programs? Banks were discussing, can we make this part of our mainstream social environmental safeguards? And so the time was ripe to do something on that. And again, we called it an assessment of early design and early implementation. We didn't call it a midterm evaluation, but it was incredibly useful. And the indigenous peoples groups, the steering committee, the UN Special Representative used that quite powerfully to advocate for more similar kinds of programs. So that's one example of reconciling that. I have a final thought on M versus E, if I may, where I could save that.
Your last contribution, the extra time was worth it, so give it a shot.
My very last contribution on the M versus E. I've been in units and I've had roles that combine the two, and I've had separate roles throughout my career. And I'm finding it really fun and freeing to be in a role that combines evaluation with learning and lets someone else do the M. Because the M, as much as we want it to be about learning, I think the CIF has some pretty creative and interesting monitoring and reporting systems that do build in joint learning. But I don't then have to be fully responsible for the report card type stuff. And that's used on a yearly basis, used for reporting. It's literally called monitoring and reporting. By tagging the learning to evaluation, I'm also freed up to do more of this ongoing learning and real-time assessment. And we do the harder hitting independent evaluations that look at performance as well. But I find it helpful to not have to integrate the monitoring side fully in my work. I'll stop there.
It's actually useful.
Me? Yes, I really want to talk about the learning, but we have to think, all those comments, they were so interesting, and they show that there is really the tension between the accountability and learning. And we have to think that I have been thinking a lot, where is the value of these formative evaluations? And to trust on that. Because sometimes these context-based evaluations, formative evaluations are very context-based evaluations, they might be more useful than to achieve, for example, the highest degree of measurability or generalization. That's what we are expecting quite often. We are expecting that this is formative, but then we say that, but we would like to it be much more summative. And there is a trade-off, and it is not easy to combine. I think that sometimes it's impossible. And that's why it is a question of trust. In formative evaluations, I think that the most important question is that who sets the evaluation questions and who sets the evaluation criteria. If you really say that this is really deep, participatory, strongly participatory evaluation, so the evaluants are really saying what are the criteria also. So, and that's why we have to think about this. Of course, we have to compromise because because the method has to be fit for the purpose. That's why I would like to, because you think that I'm so theoretical, but I have, we have concrete examples of also. Yeah. So I wrote them there. I take it, I put them here. Yes. So, so I think that this is donor or commissioner of or user of the evaluation is always think something feels like this sometimes. Do we want to prove or improve, or what do we want to do with this evaluation? We have to be quite brave to choose accountability or learning. But of course we can mix also. We have to ask whose learning are we talking about? are we aiming change in behavior, or are we really aiming to know what happens in the processes? Who decides there? Are we involving the local people enough, or something like that? These are very interesting questions. Are we talking about learning of individuals or groups or communities? And who will be responsible for the learning? They are very important questions, because I think that when we are saying nowadays, I have been thinking, why is learning so hot and topical now? Why we are talking about that so much? At the same time they say, oh no, but it is not enough, accountability matters, or something like that. So are we really ourselves as an evaluators relying on learning as a consequence of our evaluations? But here are current developmental oriented evaluations that we are currently implementing in Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Finland. I call them developmental oriented. I don't call them developmental, because it's so demanding to do that kind of. But maybe this first one, business, there is a big program, Business with Impact, with this conducted by Ministry for Foreign Affairs and Business Finland. And there we have that possibility to start the evaluation from the beginning of this very huge and valuable program. And it has lasted, it started 2015, and the evaluation has been part of this program until it ends. And it will, the evaluation ends when the program ends. And it has been, there is a joint leadership, and it continues through the duration of the program, and it feeds all the time the program, and also gives a lot of knowledge and results to the managers of the program. And there have also been very in-depth field visits. It is said that this real-time evaluation is very, I think that it works very well when you implement and integrate in the field visits of the evaluations. And I think that this has been quite successful, because now when we are at the ministry, we are planning a new BEAM, a next generation of the BEAM program, and this we have had a lot of workshops where we have used these results of this developmental evaluations results, and we have used also monitoring data. I think a question of monitoring, I think that monitoring data is very useful as a basis of evaluation. For example, a formative way to use is that those who or those project providers or project actors, they interpret themselves the monitoring data. This is for example, this midterm review of self-assessment of the country strategies was based on monitoring data. But the process, self-assessment process was facilitated by an external evaluator. And the criteria, the targets of the self-assessment was set with the project actors and the leaders. And it was very fruitful when the managers and the project actors and those counselors, the sectoral advisors, they really created the targets and the criteria for this self-assessment together. And the results of this self-assessment was used as a results report of the country strategy. And it was, I think that it was really formative and learning oriented evaluation. And then there is, of course, you may have heard that, and from the beginning, the evaluation of National Sustainable Development Policy Agenda 2030 in Finland was very participatory by nature. And but when you think that it was very short time we could implement this evaluation, so we have to think very carefully who to involve in and who should participate at this stage. That's why we took the key informants or key actors from the ministries and also from the stakeholders, and they were involved there, but not yet, for example, citizens. This will be the next step. But you have to maybe compromise a bit with this participatory element of evaluations. And then there is the knowledge management evaluation. How do we learn, manage and make decisions in Finland's development policy and cooperation? It was very timely because it focused on MFA's capability to produce and use the results information as a basis of learning and decision making. And we were quite brave that we really implemented this kind of evaluation and look inside. This was conducted by an external international evaluation group. And it was very participative by nature. And what it showed that it was timely. And the recommendations are very usable because they were, during the process, we have a lot of workshops where the tentative recommendations were interpreted together. And now, because there is ongoing reform of development practices at MFA, Finland, so we could straight ahead integrate these results to these processes. That's what I meant when I said in the beginning that it helps at the policy level or strategy level evaluations when you have those reform processes there where you can integrate this kind of evaluations. Yes. Thank you. Maybe I answered some of your comments or questions. No.
Thanks, Andy. So I'm not going to take all questions. I'm going to try and respond to Geeta, to Anupam, to Johannes, to Andrew, Henning, and the gentleman from ITAD. Right? Sorry, I didn't get your name. So let me just go with some of the questions. So first, let me just start with Johannes' question. Yeah, and this thing about, yes, they asked you to come and look at the HR policy. And that happens with us a lot of times. And I am always careful to distinguish between eminence-based value judgments and evidence-based value judgments. Are they coming to you because they think, well, Johannes is sitting there and let's just ask him what he feels about it, or whether he actually has evidence about it? And in many cases, I have to work with my team very closely to ensure that when we are advising outside, that a lot of our advice is evidence-based and not eminence-based. And it sort of mirrors also the trajectory that we saw in medical science. A lot of doctors would give opinions, which was eminence-based. And then in the 1960s, we saw the emergence of evidence-based medicine. So I think we have to be careful there, and I absolutely take your point. We have started to use a lot of synthesis, but again, syntheses also have their own biases built into them, as we know. They are informed much more by what's available in terms of what has been done in terms of quality. And so the position that my office and I have taken is that we'll try and do meta-synthesis, but we'll also look at biases. And we'll also publish those. So we'll also talk about the extent to which these may be biased and where we can't take a position. So confidence is definitely there, although we don't publish the p-values. Okay, and then on biases. So I think this question about getting grantees to talk about something and how they definitely have a view on project success. I think this goes back to the question of bias, and there's so many methods to deal with that. So clearly this is not the right forum to discuss methods, but we constantly think about biases, and I think the entire evaluation discipline has to think about biases and conflicts of interest simultaneously and at all points in time. But with LORTA, and I now want to come down to, I think, Geeta and Anupam's question around LORTA, so the learning-oriented real-time impact assessment work, and Catherine asked that question as well. So we did a few things. So just to give you an idea, it's a multi-year program. It's not a single year. It was definitely also about establishing our own legitimacy in the eyes of the GCF board and saying to them that, look, you've got this evaluation function, but at some point in time, you are going to ask us the impact question. So let us build that. It's also about building and developing those institutions. So with LORTA, the way we've chosen our investments are some of them, so it's the science and the art. The art has been to at least at the beginning, to examine which investments and managers are keen to engage with high quality evidence. Because at the beginning, we couldn't tell the management and the secretariat of the GCF, you've got to have these criteria and policies. It's a different battle, and we can go into that, but I can't go over it now. I'm also suffering from PTSD. But I think what we did was, so the art of it was to engage with programs and projects at the beginning at least, where we saw that there was an inclination to engage with evidence. But the science of it was very different. The science of it was that we looked at the entire portfolio of the GCF and said, what are the flagship programs, which are innovative, and where have we seen very little evidence globally? And therefore, what can we inform in a global sense of the word so that we are adding to the public good? So for example, climate information services. Although a lot of investment goes into it, we knew, because we'd looked at the evidence, that very little high quality evidence existed on how climate information services got translated into behavior. So we then looked at the entire swath of climate information services and worked very closely with the program managers in the secretariat as well as the project teams to then see as to the extent to which they were developing independent data systems into their own investments. The other example is somewhat controversially, adaptation. I've just finished an entire adaptation-related gap map that I presented the day before yesterday. And we clearly found that there are huge areas that are completely unevidenced or under-evidenced, even though the amount of money that the globe has spent on adaptation initiatives now goes into the trillions of dollars, and we've done that entire heat map as well. So then we worked with the adaptation sub-portfolio managers and said, look, are there programs that you think you're doing that are flagship for the GCF, so represent high risk, but also are under-evidenced in where you'd like to build your strategy going forward? And so those are the areas that we are building these database systems and independent analytical systems. Your question about the extent to which this is scalable. Clearly, so yes, of course, nothing works like money. We have to go back to the board and ask them for, in a multi-year way, to ask them for resources. But it's also part of our technical assistance. So the one other thing that we've done, which may be cool or not cool, depending on where you sit, is that we are also working very closely as part of our technical assistance work for every project. We're working with the University of Mannheim. So we've partnered with them. Right, so every investment analysis team or LORTA team basically combines staff from my office in Songdo and members of this academic department at the Center for Evaluation and Development at the University of Mannheim. And the incentive there is that we assume, and I think it's right, is that they're interested in publication. They're interested in high quality, rigorous work being done. And so that's how rigor and credibility gets built into our work. And we're interested in ensuring that this is independent. And the project team is really excited about it to the extent that, well, we're definitely supporting a lot of their data collection work with some of our resources, but that goes under technical assistance. And they get to report on their impact and get bragging rights. So it basically then has, we form the Holy Trinity essentially, where all of us have incentives for credibility, independence, and rigor.
I just want to empathize with Marie on her point on learning and for whom and for what. And I think, and Joe and I were actually having that conversation the other day, which is we expect teams and project teams and management teams to learn. What happens with evaluators learning? And at the risk of throwing some of my own work and our department work under the bus, it's, you know, often I think we suffer from the syndrome of not invented here, and therefore we go back to the drawing board and do the portfolio reviews over and over and over again for the same 1,000 projects that have been done. Do we refer to our own evaluations when we are starting evaluations? Do we refer to others who have done it? I mean, after all, this is not an inexpensive game we're talking about. This is a lot of work. This is a lot of resources being thrown at it. And I'd be curious to know, Joe, what you're spending on this partnership, because I don't think universities are inexpensive either. And so I'm thinking, you know, how can the evaluation community also start committing to actually learning from evaluation failure, learning from evaluation mistakes, and then learning to absorb others' evaluations and having trust in them?
Yeah, so just a quick thought. I guess, you know, some interesting tension, I guess, have come out today around methods and politics. So to me, there is a big question mark around, are these exercises more about methods, or they are actually, you know, how important it is actually to put the right weight on the politics, which is intrinsic in an exercise like an evaluation, and how much actually we should put faith on our methods being unbiased and, you know, and purely, eventually they could, because they could end up being just intellectual exercises which don't help to sort out the difficult dynamics and projects on the ground.
I mean, for me, the name matters. So for people, the perception around what an evaluation is, not within this room, but outside this room with our operational people, it matters what we call it. So the definition of this RTE approach has to be much more firm, as I see, and that's a challenge we have to take up. Then I think with respect to change is happening. I mean, change is happening from day 2 in a program, as I see it. At least that's our experience. Thirdly, I would say that this question about having people coming in close to the operational or to the management of a program, they need to understand and know about the context. And I think that's a practical challenge for us to get people who knows about the context, because you cannot be a critical friend without understanding what this is all about. For us, monitoring provides data. Evaluation provides knowledge.
Thanks for a very interesting. I guess where I'm coming from your talk is what we have to think about is how do we add value as evaluators? You know, and I think we add value by the lens, the skill sets that we have that we bring to management that they don't have, and also that time to ask the question why. And I think we always have to think about how we add value. And when we're doing it real time, frankly, it's going to be, you have to adapt. It's always going to be a different situation. And I don't think you'll have to be flexible. So thank you.
I think there's something I want to make sure I remember to say. The Jeff IEO has those wonderful notebooks at the back, and I've noticed some people hesitated taking them. I hope I'm not saying anything wrong. They're really useful to have. Take the notebooks and the pens. They're in multiple colors, and take them. I think that there are some sort of thematic things that are really important, but one thing that we've really heard really systematically is that the who and the how, the process, is really important. That the process generates the learning, the engagement of all the potential affected interests and interests that can affect success in the process of doing these real-time, formative, whatever we're going to call them, evaluations, is really critical to the learning. And then the branding of what we're doing, we have to be careful how we do it. And what we're hearing suggested is that the use is more important than the methods. And therefore, branding is really important. If we want to go for use, we have to get the right labels. It's going to be different in different places. That doesn't matter. We're not looking for a big publication that says this is what you should do and this is what you should call it. It's entirely adaptive to your situation. But one thematic thing is the engagement, involvement of all these interests. There's a whole bunch of contextual stuff about risk and independence or not independence and does it really matter and stuff like that. All that is in an institutional context, and you're going to adapt and change to it. But in general, this has actually been quite a remarkable session, aside from the fact that we're going to end on time with all the adaptation that has gone on. But I don't think there was a single phrase or sentence that wasn't important, that any of us said. I think everything has been really important. And what I've really noticed is there was no positioning. My agency does this, this is the best way. Everything was broached in a spirit of inquiry and wanting to do stuff well and be useful. There was no bragging going on. And, you know, we're in development evaluation. There's usually 10% of the time goes to bragging. There was none of it. We didn't waste a second on that. So I think we should give ourselves, I've got something else I want to say, but I think we should give ourselves a collective applause for doing such a good job and collaborating so well. Now, we did all this as a community. We really were doing a community of practice type thing and raising all the borders and all the edges and the fundamental issues and challenges, the important stuff about context and stuff. Well, I don't think our intent was to create a community of practice, and I don't think it is, but we will clearly be having these discussions again. And it's really important that the discussions don't repeat the territory, minding Gita's advice about learning and going on and going to the next step. So somehow we're going to have to figure out how to consolidate this, document it, and make it available and see what happens. But we need to capture, because everything was insightful and good. So thank you very much. Thank you for the presenters. Thank you for putting up with all the shifts and stuff. I think it was a great session, and thank you all very much.